Number 10. The Aztec imperial edge in resistant tributary lands. Some imperial frontiers fall apart because the center is too weak to project force. The Aztec imperial edge is darker because it could still project force, yet that force kept meeting regions where submission did not become true loyalty. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The empire's power depended heavily on conquest, intimidation, tribute, and the repeated demonstration that refusal would carry consequences. From the center, that system could look effective. Goods flowed inward, subject communities were marked as subordinate, and military prestige reinforced the image of imperial control. But tributary frontiers are not stable simply because tribute is collected. A region can pay and still resist in spirit. It can comply and still wait for weakness. It can stand inside the empire's map while never fully entering its political reality. What gave the Aztec imperial frontier its force also created its fragility. It was built less on deep administrative integration than on the ability to compel obedience and extract resources across a landscape of communities with their own histories, grievances, and local ambitions. That model can expand quickly because it does not require every subject people to become fully absorbed into a single imperial identity. But it also creates a dangerous condition at the edge. The empire's authority remains visible without becoming fully secure. Tributary lands may acknowledge power when armies are near, yet preserve resentment when armies withdraw. The imperial center sees a functioning structure. The frontier lives as a field of pressure, fear, calculation, and unfinished submission. That is what makes this borderland feel so dark. Resistant tributary regions do not have to defeat the empire outright in order to weaken it. They only have to remain zones where imperial claims and local realities never fully match. Every demand for tribute can renew resentment. Every punitive expedition can prove strength while also reminding subject peoples why they would abandon the empire the moment a better opportunity appears. On such frontiers, control is always slightly conditional. The capital may speak in the language of order, but the edge understands that order as something temporary, coercive, and vulnerable to reversal. That gap between imperial confidence and frontier memory is where reality begins to slip. The deeper lesson is that empires can look strongest at the moment they most misunderstand the nature of obedience on their own margins. That is why the Aztec imperial edge opens this list. It shows how a tributary system can claim extensive control while quietly storing instability in the very lands that sustain it. The border is not lost in one dramatic instant. It becomes a zone where the center never fully possesses what it believes it commands. And once a frontier reaches that point, the empire is no longer ruling a stable edge. It is managing the illusion of one. Number 9. The Seleucid Eastern Provinces under strain. Some imperial borderlands are overwhelmed by outside pressure so severe that collapse seems inevitable. The Seleucid East is darker because the problem was not simply pressure from beyond the frontier, but the difficulty of holding together vast eastern provinces whose realities kept straining against the empire's ability to govern them coherently. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The Seleucid Empire inherited enormous territories, and the dream of maintaining a great Hellenistic imperial order across regions that were geographically distant, politically varied, and often difficult to bind securely to the center. On a map, such rule appears magnificent. In practice, distance turns magnificence into vulnerability. The farther the center reaches, the more dangerous it becomes when administration, loyalty, military response, and local conditions begin falling out of sync. What gave the Seleucid East its importance also sharpened its instability. These eastern provinces were not empty outer zones. They were rich, strategic, culturally complex, and essential to the wider imperial imagination. To hold them meant prestige, revenue, and proof that the empire remained worthy of its inheritance. But provinces that matter this much also become places where every weakness is magnified. Local elites, regional military needs, shifting loyalties, and external pressures do not remain isolated problems. They accumulate. The center must keep projecting order across enormous distances while responding to realities that may already be changing faster than royal control can adapt. In such a setting, the frontier does not openly vanish at first. It begins to strain. Messages take time, reinforcements take time, political clarity takes time. The local world moves anyway. That is what makes the Seleucid borderlands so haunting. A province can still carry the empire's name while slowly becoming more responsive to its own logic than to the commands of the distant crown. Governors gain importance. Regional conditions start dictating policy more than ideology does. Enemies and challengers test the edges, not always because the empire has clearly fallen, but because they sense that the old level of control is becoming harder to sustain. The capital still claims continuity. The Eastern world experiences uncertainty, and once enough uncertainty accumulates, imperial rule begins to feel less like a stable order and more like a shrinking layer stretched over forces it cannot fully contain. The darker truth is that large empires often lose control of reality at the frontier before they lose control of language at the center. The Seleucid kings could still imagine themselves rulers of an immense eastern domain, yet the actual condition of that domain could grow increasingly unstable beneath the surface of official authority. That is why the Seleucid East takes this position on the list. It reveals how borderlands become dangerous when distance, pressure, and provincial strain combine to make imperial power less immediate, less trusted, and less able to match conditions on the ground. At that stage, the empire may still possess the frontier in theory. In reality, the frontier is already beginning to belong to someone else's future. Number 8. The Achaemenid Empire in restless Egypt. Some borderlands become dangerous because they are too distant to govern easily. Egypt is darker because it was not merely distant territory at the edge of imperial consciousness. It was one of the richest, most symbolically charged, and politically consequential lands an empire could possess, which meant that every sign of unrest there carried implications far beyond the province itself. That is what makes the case so unsettling. On paper, Egypt could be listed as part of the Achaemenid imperial world, administered, taxed, and claimed beneath the authority of the great king. But Egypt was never a passive possession in any simple sense. It had its own memory of kingship, its own sacred political traditions, its own elite structures, and its own capacity to imagine rule outside the imperial framework imposed from above. A land like that can be held, but holding it is not the same as transforming it into a quiet frontier. What gave Achaemenid rule in Egypt its prestige also made it unstable. To control Egypt was to command extraordinary wealth, strategic depth, and imperial legitimacy. Yet the very importance of the province made resistance there more dangerous than resistance in a lesser borderland. Egypt was too significant to ignore, too old to absorb easily, and too self-aware to remain politically neutral under outside domination. That creates a frontier unlike a desert edge or a mountain march. This is a frontier of memory, legitimacy, and recurring unrest, where imperial commands have to compete not only with immediate rebellion, but with the persistent idea that the land should belong to another order of rule. In such a place, authority becomes harder to stabilize because every act of control is measured against an older political imagination that has never fully disappeared. That is what makes Achaemenid Egypt feel so dark. The empire could still appoint officials, demand revenue, and reassert power through force, yet force alone could not eliminate the reality that Egypt remained restless beneath imperial possession. A rebellious province at the edge does more than drain resources. It distorts the empire's sense of control. The center keeps speaking in the language of stable rule, while the province keeps generating crises that reveal how conditional that rule really is. Rebellion, suppression, and renewed tension create a rhythm in which the empire is never fully secure, only temporarily dominant. Egypt remains on the map, but on the ground it behaves like a place the empire must repeatedly win back in political terms, even when it has not formally lost it. The darker lesson is that a province can belong to an empire militarily while refusing to belong to it in spirit, memory, or legitimacy. That is why restless Egypt belongs on this list. It shows how a great imperial possession can become a borderland of reality, even when it appears too rich and central to fit the word frontier. The danger lies in the mismatch between imperial claim and provincial consciousness. Once that mismatch becomes chronic, the empire no longer governs a settled possession. It governs a land that is always half turned away, always partly waiting for a different future than the one proclaimed by the crown. Number 7. Egypt's Nubian edge and contested power. Some imperial borders are dangerous because they face powerful enemies. The Nubian edge is darker because it was not simply a line separating Egypt from a foreign world. It was a contested zone where influence, military pressure, trade, culture, and political ambition met in ways that made control inherently unstable. That is what makes the case so unsettling. From the perspective of the Egyptian center, the southern frontier could be imagined as something to secure, monitor, dominate, and use. Fortresses, expeditions, administration, and symbolic claims all suggest a state trying to impose clarity on the edge of its world. But borderlands shaped by long contact do not stay simple. They become zones where both sides adapt, negotiate, resist, and reimagine power. The empire wants a frontier. The frontier becomes a political environment of its own. What gave this borderland its importance also made it difficult to master. Nubia mattered strategically, economically, and symbolically. It offered roots, resources, military significance, and a southern dimension to Egyptian power that could not simply be ignored. Yet precisely because it mattered so much, the region could never be treated as a passive outer shell. Influence had to be maintained, not merely declared. Local powers had to be managed, not merely conquered. A contested frontier of this kind does not settle into permanent obedience unless the center can keep projecting force, legitimacy, and practical control over long stretches of time. Once any of those begin to weaken, the edge stops reflecting imperial certainty and starts revealing how much that certainty always depended on constant effort. That is what makes Egypt's Nubian edge feel so haunting. A borderland like this can remain under nominal authority while power on the ground grows more fluid than the center admits. Local actors become more important. Imperial officials may still report order, but lived reality includes negotiation, resistance, and the possibility that southern power can gather strength of its own. The farther one moves from the core, the harder it becomes to maintain the illusion that the center alone defines the terms of rule. The frontier acquires memory. It remembers past conquests, past reversals, and the fact that power can move in more than one direction. That is what makes contested border zones so dangerous to imperial self-understanding. They do not simply resist. They teach the empire that its authority is conditional. The deeper lesson is that some frontiers become unstable not because they are chaotic, but because they are active political worlds in their own right. That is why Egypt's Nubian edge belongs here. It reveals how an empire can lose control of reality, not by abandoning the border, but by continuing to claim it in terms too simple for what it has become. The center may still imagine a controlled southern boundary. On the ground, the boundary is a shifting arena of pressure, adaptation, rivalry, and contested power. Once a frontier reaches that stage, the empire no longer faces a fixed edge. It faces a region that is shaping the meaning of control for itself. Number 6. The Hittite border zones before imperial collapse. Some frontier regions become dangerous because an empire is suddenly struck by an overwhelming external shock. The Hittite border zones are darker because they seem to reveal a world where danger was already accumulating at the edges before the full collapse made itself undeniable. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The Hittite Empire was a major late Bronze Age power, a kingdom of treaties, dynastic politics, military campaigns, and regional influence that depended on maintaining authority across a difficult and politically layered landscape. From the center, Borderlands could be described through loyalty, vassalage, and strategic control. But the farther imperial order stretches across contested terrain, the more dangerous it becomes when those outer layers begin to thin. By the time a frontier openly breaks, the deeper problem may already be that the empire no longer understands how unstable its own margins have become. What gave the Hittite imperial edge its strength also created its fragility. Border zones were not empty spaces. They were areas of negotiation, military pressure, rival influence, local rulership, and shifting commitment. The Hittite center depended on more than direct command. It depended on the reliability of subordinate powers, on the credibility of royal authority, and on the continued ability of the empire to make its presence felt beyond the core. That kind of system can be effective, but it is highly sensitive to weakening trust. If local rulers begin doubting the center, if rival powers sense opportunity, or if communication and military response grow less dependable, then the frontier begins slipping into a condition where formal allegiance tells only part of the story. The empire still claims the edge. The edge begins living by more conditional rules. That is what makes these border zones feel so haunting. A frontier before collapse is often a place where the future arrives early. Local actors hedge their bets. Neighboring forces probe for weakness. Officials continue using the language of established order, but the practical meaning of that order becomes harder to sustain. The Hittite world may still appear intact in principle, yet its margins start behaving like places no longer fully secured by imperial confidence. That is the darker truth of unstable borderlands. They do not merely wait to be lost. They become places where the empire's own uncertainty starts leaking outward, making every treaty, every alliance, and every defensive assumption less reliable than it once seemed. The deeper lesson is that imperial collapse often becomes visible first at the edges, not because the edges matter less, but because they are where hidden weakness is hardest to disguise. That is why the Hittite border zones belong on this list. They suggest a frontier world in which the center's authority was becoming harder to translate into lived control even before the final breakdown of the empire. The walls of the core may still stand. The titles of kings may still be proclaimed. But once the margins stop believing in the same reality as the capital, the empire is already closer to collapse than it knows. Number 5, the Neo-Assyrian frontier, under constant revolt. Some imperial borders are dangerous because they face strong enemies beyond the line. The Neo-Assyrian frontier is darker because the danger did not always come from one cleanly defined enemy outside. It came from a landscape where revolt, suppression, punishment, and renewed resistance formed an almost permanent political condition. That is what makes the case so chilling. Assyria built one of the most feared military empires of the ancient world. Its kings campaigned relentlessly, its armies moved with terrifying force, and its state projected the message that rebellion would be crushed with exemplary violence. From the imperial center, this seemed like a language of control. But a frontier that must be repeatedly subdued is not the same thing as a frontier fully mastered. The more often revolt returns, the more it exposes the gap between terror and stability. What gave the Assyrian border its force also sharpened its instability. The empire relied on military pressure, provincial administration, deportation, intimidation, and the constant demonstration that Assyria could reach the edge and punish defiance. Such methods can produce obedience, and often very quickly. But obedience produced by fear can remain thin beneath the surface. A region may submit because resistance is temporarily impossible, not because imperial authority has become accepted as durable reality. In that kind of borderland, revolt is never simply a local accident. It is evidence that the center's power, while immense, has not fully transformed the political logic of the frontier. The empire can destroy enemies. it cannot always end the conditions that keep generating them. That is what makes the Neo-Assyrian frontier feel so dark. Constant revolt turns the border into a place where the empire's greatest strength becomes part of its deeper weakness. Every successful suppression proves Assyrian power, yet every renewed uprising proves that power has not secured permanence. The state continues to claim mastery, but the frontier keeps answering with instability. Reports of rebellion, punitive campaigns, restored order, and later unrest create a grim cycle in which imperial certainty and local resistance feed one another. The center still speaks in absolutes. The edge lives in recurrence. That is how an empire begins losing control of reality while still winning battles. It mistakes the ability to punish for the ability to settle. The deeper lesson is that frontiers ruled through fear can remain visibly imperial while internally refusing to become stable. That is why the Neo-Assyrian Borderlands take this place on the list. They reveal a world where imperial force was terrifyingly real, yet the conditions on the ground remained too resistant, too layered, and too politically alive to be permanently frozen by conquest alone. In the end, the danger of such a frontier is not merely that it rebels. It is that it keeps teaching the empire the same lesson over and over again. While the empire keeps refusing to learn it, terror can dominate the edge, but it cannot always define reality there forever. Number 4. The Abbasid marches and fractured authority. Some imperial borderlands become dangerous because enemies gather beyond them in obvious strength. The Abbasid marches are darker because the threat grew in a world where authority at the edge had already become fractured, negotiated, and increasingly difficult for the center to hold together in any unified way. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The Abbasid Caliphate could still project the language of universal rule, religious legitimacy, and caliphal supremacy, but frontier zones do not live by language alone. They live by who commands troops, who collects revenue, who negotiates with local powers, and who can actually make imperial claims matter on the ground. Once those functions begin to drift into competing hands, a borderland ceases to be a firm line of imperial order. It becomes a patchwork of overlapping realities, each one only partly controlled by the center that still claims them all. What gave the Abbasid frontier its strength also created its fragility. Marches can be effective buffers precisely because they are militarized, adaptive, and politically responsive to local conditions. They allow the empire to extend influence without having to administer every outer zone in exactly the same way as the core. But that flexibility comes at a cost. Frontier command can become personalized. Military leaders can gain regional weight. Local elites can become essential intermediaries rather than subordinate instruments. Over time, the very structures meant to preserve Abbasid control at the edge can start generating semi-independent forms of power within it. The caliph still matters, but the lived political order of the marches becomes harder to reduce to simple obedience. That is what makes the Abbasid marches feel so dark. Fractured authority does not always announce itself as rebellion. Often it appears first as ambiguity. Orders are followed selectively. Local commanders speak in the empire's name while acting in their own interests. Border diplomacy and frontier warfare begin to reflect regional calculations more than central design. The empire still sees a defended edge. The edge increasingly experiences a world of negotiated power, personal loyalty, temporary arrangements, and shifting control. In that environment, the center does not merely risk losing territory, it risks losing the ability to know which parts of its own frontier are truly imperial in anything more than formal terms. The deeper lesson is that some empires begin losing control of reality, not when the frontier collapses outright, but when the frontier develops too many centers of power inside the shell of official unity. That is why the Abbasid marches belong here. They reveal how a great imperial system can continue proclaiming order while the actual mechanisms of control at the border become fragmented enough to create a different political world. Once a march reaches that stage, the empire is no longer standing at the edge of a clear domain. It is standing at the edge of its own weakening ability to define what rule means there at all. Number 3. Han Dynasty control and rebellion in the northwest. Some frontiers become dangerous because they are remote and difficult to supply. The Han Northwest is darker because it was not only a distant zone of military concern. It was a region where imperial control repeatedly had to prove itself against instability, resistance, and the reality that outer territories do not become secure simply because the dynasty says they belong within the realm. That is what makes the case so unsettling. From the center, the northwest could be imagined through garrisons, administration, routes, colonization, and strategic necessity. It was a place to hold, organize, and defend. But borderlands of this kind are never static. They are zones where empires confront mobile threats, local tensions, logistical strain, and the constant possibility that authority will remain thinner on the ground than it looks in official language. What gave Han power in the northwest its importance also sharpened its instability. This was not a marginal space the dynasty could casually abandon. It mattered for security, communication, prestige, and the broader architecture of imperial reach. To control it meant more than holding land. It meant proving that the Han state could extend order into a difficult frontier world and keep it there. Yet precisely because the region mattered so much, its tensions became more dangerous. Garrison life, administrative burden, local unrest, competing loyalties, and the challenge of sustaining command over long distances created a frontier that continually tested the dynasty's ability to turn military presence into durable reality. A borderland can be occupied and still remain politically unsettled underneath. That is what makes the Han Northwest feel so haunting. Rebellion and control do not alternate cleanly. They often exist together. The empire may still hold forts, roads, and officials in place, while unrest keeps revealing how contested that control remains. Reports sent to the center speak in the language of restoration, order, and renewed command, yet the local world continues to produce instability that has to be managed again and again. On such a frontier, the dynasty risks confusing repetition with success. Each act of suppression can seem like proof of restored order, while actually revealing how incomplete that order has always been. The map remains imperial. The reality remains conditional. The darker lesson is that some frontiers undermine imperial confidence not because they disappear, but because they remain perpetually difficult to make ordinary. That is why Han control and rebellion in the northwest takes this place on the list. It shows how a dynasty can keep projecting authority into a strategic region while never fully escaping the need to reconquer its meaning over and over again. Once a borderland reaches that point, the empire is no longer simply defending its edge. It is struggling against a deeper truth. The farther from the center it goes, the less certain it becomes that imperial order and lived reality are still the same thing. Number 2. The Eastern Roman frontier in late Syria. Some imperial borders become dangerous because they are attacked too often to remain calm. Late Roman Syria is darker because it was not only a military frontier under pressure. It was a zone where imperial administration, local society, strategic defense, and the larger crisis of empire began to overlap in ways that made control itself harder to define. That is what makes the case so unsettling. From Constantinople, or any strong imperial center, Syria could still be imagined as a governed province, defended through cities, roads, commanders, taxation, and the established language of Roman order. But borderlands do not remain what the center calls them, when war, strain, and local adaptation begin reshaping daily reality faster than imperial systems can respond. At that point, the empire does not merely face danger at the edge. It begins losing confidence in what the edge actually is. What gave the Eastern Roman frontier its strength also sharpened its fragility. Syria mattered immensely. It was wealthy, strategic, urban, and connected to trade, religion, administration, and the wider military architecture of the Eastern Empire. To hold it was to preserve not just land, but a whole vision of Roman continuity in the Near East. Yet the more important such a province becomes, the more devastating prolonged instability can be. Repeated warfare, defensive burden, shifting loyalties, heavy demands, and the strain of sustaining imperial structures in a contested world can turn a once legible province into something harder to govern in ordinary ways. Cities still stand, officials still operate, armies still move. But underneath, the relationship between centre and province begins to thin, because the lived reality of survival at the frontier no longer fully matches the administrative language of stable rule. That is what makes late Syrian frontier life feel so dark. A province under this kind of pressure does not always vanish from imperial control in one dramatic rupture. Instead, it becomes a place where the old assumptions stop functioning with the same certainty. Local communities adapt, regional actors become more important, defensive needs distort normal governance. The state keeps trying to preserve a recognizable Roman order, yet the conditions on the ground keep pushing life toward emergency, improvisation, and uncertainty. The empire still claims continuity, but the frontier begins living in a world where continuity is increasingly conditional. That gap between claim and condition is where control begins to lose contact with reality. The deeper lesson is that Borderlands can remain visibly imperial, while internally becoming harder and harder to rule as ordinary provinces. That is why late Syria takes this place on the list. It reveals how a great empire can continue speaking in the language of law, administration, and enduring sovereignty, even while one of its most important frontiers is being transformed by pressure into something more unstable, more fragile, and less fully understood by the center itself. Once that happens, the empire is no longer simply guarding a border. It is trying to preserve a version of reality that the frontier is already starting to outgrow. Number 1. Roman Britain in the shadow of withdrawal. Some imperial borderlands collapse because they are decisively conquered from outside. Roman Britain is darker because its final atmosphere is haunted by something more unsettling: the slow emergence of a frontier world in which imperial presence still casts a shadow even as the reality behind that presence begins to drain away. That is what makes the case so chilling. Britain had long been part of the Roman imperial system, connected through military occupation, urban life, administration, roads, taxation, and the symbolic authority of Rome itself. From the centre, or even from within provincial habit, this could still look like a durable extension of Roman order. But the moment that order begins to weaken, a province at the edge does not simply become empty. It becomes ambiguous. The empire is still remembered, still invoked, still structurally present in fragments, yet increasingly unable to guarantee the world it once claimed to organize. What gave Roman Britain its strength also created its vulnerability. It was a frontier province shaped by military investment, imperial infrastructure, and the broader belief that Rome could make even distant edges part of a coherent political reality. That belief mattered. It held together administration, identity, security, and the expectation that the province ultimately belonged to a larger system strong enough to support it. But once that larger system began redirecting energy, weakening in cohesion, or losing the capacity to sustain distant commitments, Britain became exposed in a uniquely disturbing way. A borderland built to function within empire now had to confront the possibility of surviving with the form of Roman order but without the force behind it. Walls remain, towns remain, offices may remain in name. The empire behind them begins to recede. That is what makes Roman Britain so haunting. Withdrawal is not only a military event, it is a collapse of certainty. Local elites, soldiers, communities, and regional leaders must suddenly inhabit a world in which Roman categories still exist, but the imperial machinery that gave them consistent meaning is no longer fully there. The frontier does not instantly transform into something new. It lingers in between realities. It still carries the memory of empire, yet it begins operating under conditions Rome can no longer fully supervise, rescue, or define. This is one of the darkest forms of imperial loss, because the map may continue to imply belonging long after actual control has thinned into memory, improvisation, and local survival. That is why Roman Britain takes the #1 place on this list. Its story captures the deepest theme running through all these borderlands. Empires often lose control of reality before they lose control of image. Britain remained marked by Rome even as Rome's ability to sustain what that mark meant was fading. The centre's shadow lingered after the centre's power had begun to withdraw. And that is what makes the case so unnerving. A frontier does not have to be openly abandoned to stop being truly imperial. Sometimes it becomes most dangerous in the moment when everyone can still see the outline of empire, but no one can be certain that the empire itself is really there anymore.